Performance reviews can be complex, and for some, stressful. Even for those excelling, they can be a source of anxiety. For individuals who know they aren't doing as well as they should, they can be enormously tense, and that goes for those receiving them and giving them alike. Welcome to Yo's Back to Work podcast. I'm your host, Joe McIntyre. On this episode, we'll explore how proper performance reviews can retain top talent, discover potential issues, address existing challenges, and boost morale. Often, reviews can either be a turning point in an employee's career or a stumbling block that negatively impacts the employee and subsequently the company. Finding the right balance comes down to knowing how and when to use constructive feedback to mentor your team. Our guest for this episode is Zach Davis, General Counsel at Yo. Zach has spent his career as an employment attorney, and as a member of the Yo leadership team, he is responsible for legal advice to the business, review of contracts, and compliance support. Zach joins us to give his insights into making performance reviews positive and productive for both employers and employees alike. Now, although Zach is an attorney, the information he is providing here in this podcast does not and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, all information and content is for general information purposes only. Listeners should contact their own attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular legal matter discussed on this podcast. No listener should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information in this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. Only your individual attorney can provide assurances that the information contained herein and your interpretation of it is applicable or appropriate to your particular situation. All right, enough of that. Zach, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great, it's great to have you. So first, Zach, can you explain what makes a performance review beneficial for both employers and employees? I know they're so stressful, especially for employees, but I think we discount some of the employer impacts as well.
They're less stressful when they're done properly. A good performance management system and a good performance review system is really about making the employee a better employee, making the employer a better employer, creating an atmosphere where there's a sort of a free exchange of constructive criticism, where employees understand that you're not necessarily criticizing them as a human being, but that everyone, myself included, everyone has something they can be better at work. And a performance review should be measured both good and bad. So it's not just bad, because employees tend to feel threatened or attacked. If a performance review, it focuses more on the bad than the good. But if you have an underperforming employee, the performance review is the best opportunity to make them aware of their deficiencies, and most importantly, to provide a path to fix those deficiencies so that the employee can not only remain an employee, but become a more productive employee, which obviously is for the benefit of the employer.
Yeah. Zach, I think we need to just inform our audience a little bit. You're General Counsel at Yo. Why are you the one that we have on here? Maybe you can explain to our listeners to speak about this. Why are you kind of our go-to? I'll let you do it.
Sure. So in addition to being General Counsel at Yo, I've spent my entire career as a management side employment attorney. And part of that role involves doing trainings on performance management and effective performance management, because ineffective performance management can be a leading source of employment litigation. When employees feel that they've not been treated fairly, that their performance has not been evaluated fairly, that is often something that causes a terminated employee to feel that they've actually been the victim of a violation of one or more employment laws. And so it leads to employment litigation. Now that I'm in-house at Yo, a huge portion of my job is taking measures that I characterize as litigation prevention, which is to make sure we have the correct processes in place, and in some aspects have the correct culture in place to reduce employment litigation. And one of the leading ways to reduce employment litigation is to create a culture where employees feel that they are being treated fairly. And a big part of effective performance evaluation is making employees feel that they are being treated fairly, which is to say, you can still offer constructive criticism of their performance. You can still tell them the things they need to do better, but you're doing so in an atmosphere where the employee understands that criticizing their performance is not necessarily criticizing them as a person. And you're also giving them a chance to provide their own feedback on their performance, so that as long as they feel that they've been evaluated fairly, you are taking great steps to reduce your overall employment litigation, but also to promote a constructive work culture. all of that falls under my loose job description as general counsel of a staffing company.
Got it. So you mentioned a couple things, fairness or unfairness. What has gone wrong, or what has always been the issue that goes wrong when it comes to performance reviews and the way they're given?
There are a couple of sort of big picture ways that a performance review can go wrong. Um, and I can take them there's no particular order to this. They're all on the list of things that need to be avoided, and ways that performance evaluations go wrong. One is there is a natural human tendency to be non-confrontational. And part of the burden of being a supervisor or a manager is having the willingness to overcome your natural inclination at being non-confrontational and be willing to look your employees in the eye and tell them these are the things you need to do better. And so what we find a lot are performance evaluations that get, for lack of a better term, sugar-coated. And so the employee is never made aware of the things they are doing wrong. And then a manager allows those things to linger and frankly fester, and until they reach a point where suddenly the manager says, this employee is such a bad employee, they can no longer work for me. And the manager moves to termination. And when the employee gets terminated, the employee says, why am I being terminated? And the manager says, well, it's because you're doing all these things wrong. And the employee says, well, nobody ever told me that. And that's a huge source of employee relations issues, not just litigation, because this is not just about a company avoiding getting sued, right? This is about creating a work atmosphere where people genuinely feel that they have the opportunity to thrive and succeed. And people generally feel that, first of all, they like coming to work, but that they can get along with their supervisor while still understanding the supervisor is permitted to criticize them. And it's really about creating that entire culture where both employer and employee feel that everyone is united in sort of doing what's best for the company. I know that's a long answer and a tangential answer, but when a manager is non-confrontational, that's sort of the first problem that leads to somebody being terminated and also feeling as though they are not being treated fairly in that process. So I would say that's really the biggest issue that I see in performance evaluations. Along the same lines with being non-confrontational is not delivering performance feedback in a timely manner. So you wait and wait and wait. And then by the time you give feedback, instead of addressing a single mistake or two mistakes, you're addressing 6 or 12 months worth of mistakes. And now the employee feels attacked and threatened. And hey, that was 6 months ago. How come you never mentioned it then? And so again, not at the risk of repeating myself, all of these concerns lead to employees feeling as though they are not being treated fairly. And employees feeling as though they are not being treated fairly is the leading source of employment litigation and workplace problems and things of that nature.
Now, how often, Zach, should performance reviews be given? Is there a happy medium, best practice? I guess, how do you find the balance between having too many and then making the employee feel isolated with questioning themselves?
So that's a great question. And here, there's sort of formal performance reviews and informal performance reviews, right? I would say you've got the capital P, capital R performance review, and then the lowercase p, lowercase r. A formal performance review every 6 months is probably about right. Here, we tend to do a mid-year review and a year-end review. And that's enough. You don't want to be formally reviewing someone's performance every month, because if you're identifying deficiencies, you have to allow the employee time to fix them. And if I tell you you're not making enough widgets during the day, each day, and then a week later I criticize you again for not, like, you haven't had enough opportunity to fix whatever's wrong. So every 6 months is fine. That being said, the informal performance review should happen a lot more often. And here it's really important to balance the positive with the negative. So if I do something really well, it's great for my supervisor to come by and just give me a quick pat on the back. Hey, Zach, you did a great job of that presentation today. Or, hey, Zach, I saw that email you sent or that memo you wrote. Great work. Similarly, hey, Zach, I saw you did this training, but you said X, Y, and Z, and maybe that wasn't the right way to phrase it, and maybe you need to do better next time. Here, we encourage our managers to have one-to-one meetings with their direct reports. We encourage it to happen weekly, We like to see it happen at least every other week. And a one-to-one, a half-hour one-to-one meeting at that type of interval, you wouldn't consider that a performance review every time. It shouldn't be, but it is an opportunity during those regular meetings to just address the little performance issues. Again, good and bad. I don't want to make this all about what they're doing wrong. It's a great opportunity to get positive feedback. And then when you build up to the formal performance review every 6 months, again, nothing should happen at that meeting that comes as a surprise to the employee, because you've been checking in with the employee once, twice, 3, 4 times a month. So the employee is well aware of what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. Then the 6-month review is really just an encapsulation of the last 6 months of informal performance reviews, and you're documenting them and providing ratings and things like that.
There's this theory that, like, when it comes to constructive criticism, you do the sandwich method, positive, negative, and positive. How do you, as a manager, create an environment where employees feel like they can accept or at least understand constructive criticism and how to react to that?
There's no magic answer to this. I've heard people advocate for the sandwich method, and I've heard very experienced HR professionals say that the sandwich method does not work because employees tend to, I think this is true of any person, sometimes you only hear the negative. Once someone has provided negative feedback, if you're following that up with positive feedback, that gets ignored. So it's really, I find, the way I try anyway, and you'd have to talk to my direct reports to find out if this is successful or not, but my method is you have to let people know. Well, the first step is, I think, creating a culture where mistakes are okay within reason. So first of all, I'm a lawyer. The only career I've ever had is law. And when I was a junior associate at law firms, the best partners, or the ones I enjoyed working for the most, they would actually use the phrase, that's why they call it practicing law, because you make mistakes and you get better. And I've rephrased that, and I tell most of the people who work for me, you can make almost any mistake once. And I expect people will make mistakes. You're learning on the job. You're trying to figure things out. What drives me crazy as a manager is when you make a mistake and you learn and you get called out for it, and then you make the same mistake again, because then you're not learning. And so part of that is creating that atmosphere. I think you have to be willing to tolerate mistakes and not make every employee feel as though every mistake is suddenly a terminable offense. Of course, there are terminable offenses, but I'm talking about, again, to use a legal term, we're talking about misdemeanors and not felonies, right? And so you have to allow for that, while also creating a culture. Like I said, if you make a mistake and I address that with you, I don't want to see you making that mistake again, because now that's a real performance problem. That's a failure to improve and a failure to learn from your mistakes. Yeah. So I think that's part of it. And some of it is just your general demeanor. I think the more often you are giving feedback, both positive and negative, and not necessarily at the same time, it doesn't have to be the sandwich method, the more your direct reports understand, hey, my boss is going to tell me when I do things well and tell me when I'm not doing things well, and it's going to be an ongoing dialogue. I think that creates this atmosphere where constructive criticism is tolerated. And that helps promote the idea that we're going to have this ongoing performance management discussion without necessarily making everybody feel like the guillotine is hanging over their head.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned the importance of not just having reviews every 6 months or once a year, but having those regular check-ins, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, whatever works. But when an issue is identified during, one of those weekly check-ins, how do you evaluate whether that person is, overcoming it or create steps to make sure it doesn't happen again? So if someone makes a mistake, is it just don't do that again? Or is it much more than that?
Well, some of it depends on the nature of the mistake, because there are times when I've looked at people and said, please don't do that ever again. But usually you're trying to find a path forward. So part of it is I've had more years of experience than a lot of the people who report to me. And so I call on that and I say, look, here's the evolution of this. You make this mistake once, next time you're going to try it a different way. Maybe you try it a different way on the third time. But you want to see from your directs an interest in improving their performance, and enthusiasm for improving their performance. Sometimes there are communication issues you can't overcome. Sometimes there are generational differences that are hard to bridge. But again, there's no real magic words or perfect answer for this. Some of it is understanding the personalities of the people who report to you and figuring out what their motivators are and how you can touch on those in order to spurn and improve performance.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned, you obviously have multiple different types of people on your team. All of us are very different. Does that mean we need to give feedback or give performance reviews differently to everyone, either, dramatically or just slight differences to everyone, or is it better to just give the same kind of feedback to everybody?
Well, that's a great question because the answer is yes to both of those choices.
Yeah.
On some, certainly when it comes to informal feedback, um, the better bet is to customize that for the personality of the people you're speaking to. When it comes to formal feedback, you are better off reducing your informal feedback to a standardized format for formal feedback. So when you have a rating scale, when you're telling an employee they need improvement or they meet expectations or they exceed expectations, you want to be applying the same criteria to every person you're evaluating because you need consistency in that regard. But when you're trying to explain to someone why you're not happy with their performance, or again, if you're trying to give them a compliment, right? Everybody needs to hear that in the way that they will best understand and interpret that. Another burden of management is you need to communicate with people on their level and not expect them to be able to communicate on your level. So part of it is being a bit of a chameleon and figuring out, okay, I'm talking to you. What is the method that you are going to be able to hear and interpret and internalize the things I'm saying? Some people need it in writing, some people it's verbal, some people it's a little bit of both, but also your tone, the language you use. It all matters, and the goal is to make sure whoever you are speaking to understands what you're saying. And your job as the manager is to choose whatever method is most likely to make that happen.
Yeah, Zach, you mentioned you've been doing this for a little bit now, and you
Yeah.
mentioned, drawing from your own personal experience to help someone through a mistake or an error or something they need to improve. Is there a real world example that you can give on how a proper performance review became a turning point for someone who was either struggling or, wasn't quite getting it, and then you talk to them and then, something better happened after that?
Sure. I have to be careful of attorney-client privilege here, but
Mhm.
setting that aside, no, I can think of a couple of examples where when I was a partner at a law firm and we had junior associates and talking to the junior associates and trying to identify, in one example, an associate who had very good analytical skills and not, what's the best way to phrase this? I don't want to say poor, but underwhelming writing skills. And we were able to identify that fairly early on in their career. And then we found training programs, a legal writing program that this person could attend that would improve their writing skills. And we put the person through that, and the writing skills turned around, and they were able to blossom that aspect of their career because legal writing is a very important part of being a law firm lawyer. Um, and so they were able to take that skill and turn it around and improve and ultimately thrive at the law firm. I will say this, it's a successful performance evaluation does not necessarily mean that the employee was able to turn their performance around and improve. Sometimes, and this is especially true among junior associates at law firms, sometimes the performance evaluation lands with maybe this actually isn't the right career for you. There are lots of things one can do with a law degree, and being a big firm lawyer is only one of them. And we were able to identify in certain circumstances, again, you're not a bad person. You're not even necessarily a bad employee. You've just chosen the wrong path. And because we're lawyers in the community, there's at least one instance I can think of where we liked the person and we were actually able to help them find another job doing something slightly different because we were able to recognize what they were good at and what they were not good at and find a different path for a lawyer that allowed that person to excel, to use the skills they excelled at, I should say. So there's nothing wrong with using the performance management system to identify people who are maybe miscast or simply need to find a different role in order to succeed.
Yeah, that was my next question. It was, how can we judge if a performance review was effective or not? But it's not when someone, improves necessarily. It's not when someone identifies, hey, maybe this isn't for me. It could be a combination of things that these can be effective at. Yeah, it's interesting.
There are people, everybody brings a different skill set. And when you hire someone, you have a very limited window into what their skill set actually is. And then a lot of times people come to a job and they find that or the employer finds that the skill set doesn't quite match what is required. Or you see, and this happens at every company, in America, someone is hired in the correct job and they do a great job, and then they get promoted to a job that they're actually not as good at. And so performance, it's not just performance management, it's performance evaluation and the ability to recognize if you have somebody in the wrong role to try and it's better for everyone involved if you can find a better role for them rather than say, you know what, this isn't working out and we're going to have to let you go. Because, and I would say, I think Day & Zimmerman is actually very good, and but Day & Zimmerman as the parent company is pretty good at looking at its talent. And if we have people who have talent that is not best used in their current role, this company is pretty good at suggesting or moving someone to a role where we think they might be more successful.
Yeah, that takes a certain type of company to be willing to do that, and I feel like that's built into a culture of
Very
not
much
giving
so.
up on people. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
very much so. And companies that are poor at performance evaluation and performance management will just cut ties and throw their hands up in the air and say, oh, well, it didn't work out. Whereas everybody has something to add, right? And maybe you can't find a spot for them, but you're better off putting in as an employer, you're better off putting in the effort to find a better spot for an employee that's already on board than to cut that employee loose and start the hiring process all over again.
Yep. Yeah, Zach, we're doing this recording virtually here in many ways. The world still exists in a hybrid working environment for a lot of companies, some not, where some reviews even may be conducted virtually. So I'm sure there is a lot that can be lost in translation, and we've learned this over the past 4+ years at this point that a lot can be lost. How can managers ensure they deliver critiques virtually and criticism virtually and reviews virtually in an effective way? Is it possible?
It is possible. It's unquestionably more difficult than being able to do it in person. I currently manage an entirely remote workforce, so I've encountered this issue. And part of the answer to this question is the same as my answer to the previous questions, right? If you've created weekly or biweekly touch points with your employees, if you've had the informal performance reviews along the way, then you don't have as much concern about what happens during the formal performance review because the employee is not going to be caught off guard. And I can say this in case any of my current direct reports listen to this podcast, that the next story is not about any of them. It's about a previous life, about a previous job I've had. Where you have to deliver particularly negative performance, even if you're not putting someone on a performance improvement plan, even if you're not threatening their job, if you get this sense during the review that the person is feeling, oh my God, my boss hates me, or I have no future at this company, I have scheduled immediate follow-up meetings with the person. Hey, it's 2 days later. I just want to touch base again. I just want to let you know your job here is not in jeopardy, but I needed to go over these things with you. Then you have to step up the frequency of contact with that employee, especially remote. I mean, there's all kinds of studies out now in general that remote work is leading to a lack of employee engagement. And I heard someone describe it as an epidemic of loneliness, because when you have particularly if you have a negative performance review, you feel for the person who, okay, the review's over, they turn off their camera, and now they're just home alone in an office with no one to talk to and nothing to do. And that can be a real problem because it's going to allow the employee to stew in the negative review. And so, because in person, you could give someone a negative review and then tell someone else, hey, go grab Zach and take him out to lunch because he needs a pick-me-up, right? And you could work on that. It's not possible if everybody's sitting in a different zip code. So yeah, it's an issue. It can still be done effectively, but it ties back to the whole creating a culture and making sure that this every 6-month performance review isn't the be all and end all of their career.
Now, Zach, let's take the crystal ball out just a little bit here. AI has been talked about a lot. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least bring it up here and how it may impact the world of performance reviews. But do you expect artificial intelligence or some other similar technology to impact the way performance reviews are conducted, either good, bad, or not at all?
Well, I've come to expect that artificial intelligence is going to affect every aspect of being an employer and being a business. Full disclosure, and the folks in our IT department here know this well about me. I am deeply technophobic and do not trust AI at all. I am way on one side of the spectrum here, and I will be among the last people to embrace this technology. But I have accepted that it exists and that it is every day more and more affecting the way companies do business. I would say, yes, I think AI will affect this process. I think there are ways, both positive and negative, it could affect the process. Almost by definition, there is a risk that it will make the process less personal. And I think it's important on both a positive feedback and negative feedback situation that an employee feel a personal connection with the person delivering that feedback. And so if we ever get to a point where your performance review is being delivered by an avatar, you're going to run the risk that the employee feels this is a very impersonal process. And so that ties back to employee engagement and how well do I feel my employer knows me, things of that nature. On a positive move, I think AI can help us draft appropriate language to deliver to an employee. I think AI can help us evaluate performance reviews for unconscious bias, which I know is a bit of a loaded term, but it really does exist, and it really is something that both HR departments and legal departments are on the lookout for. AI can look at the last 50 performance reviews I've done and make sure that I am not inadvertently biased for or against certain groups. And you can fill in the blank on whatever group that might be, but it is a useful tool for looking at that. Am I using harsher language to describe the conduct of certain types of employees? Am I tolerating mistakes of certain types of employees that I am not tolerating of others? Unequal or unfair performance reviews, to tie this back to the beginning of today's podcast, unfair performance reviews is a huge source of liability for a company. And AI, I think, has a role in helping determine. We don't want AI to make the ultimate decision, but AI can provide feedback. Hey, Zach, I've looked at the way you do things, and I'm not sure you're being completely fair between different types of employees. So I think there is definitely a role for it in this process.
Hey, Zach, thanks once again for joining us on Back to Work and giving us and our listeners some best practices for getting the most out of performance reviews. So thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into Yo's Back to Work podcast. To hear future episodes of this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen in. For Yo's Back to Work, I'm Joe McIntyre. Thanks for listening.